There has been a lot of speculation since the election as to Carney's plans for gun control in Canada. Many have been suggesting that there is in fact a pragmatic side to him which could indicate that the future may not be as bleak for gun owners as it was under Trudeau. But is any of that true? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today I'm finally going to be weighing in on my thoughts since Carney officially became Prime Minister. It's been 3 long weeks since the election and lots has happened since then. Now a lot of this video won't exactly be news for people who have been paying attention to recent events, but I do want to chime in with some of my own thoughts to maybe give your viewers some extra food for thought. So what might we expect out of this new government going forward on the gun control file? Now, I know a lot of pro-gun people have come out since the election cautioning that Carney may not be as charged as Trudeau in this regard. They tend to say something along the lines that Carney is more pragmatic, that the confiscation program is objectively a waste of funds because it'll have no impact on public safety, and that Carney might use these observations to perhaps slow down the gun control agenda or maybe even bring a halt to it. They also tend to point out that during the election, gun control didn't really play much of a role at all. And fair enough, it actually was a pretty minor issue for the most part, and for the one press conference that was held on it, Carney clearly had no idea what was going on with the gun control conversation here in Canada. He also didn't really know who Nathalie Provost was or what her history was. And like I say, fair enough. But those same people tend to not give enough credit to the other things that he said.
You can't be serious about being tough on crime if you're not willing to be tough on guns. You can't be serious about stopping intimate partner violence without being serious about gun control. If elected, my government will. We will quickly, and I mean quickly, reinvigorate the buyback of assault-style firearms.
He promised that, if elected, the confiscation program would happen quickly. So for me, I don't really see him being any different than Trudeau. He might be less inflammatory about it, but I don't see the end result turning out any differently. I mean, heck, if he's even half as competent as his voters mistakenly believe him to be, perhaps he can actually succeed in advancing and completing the confiscation program, which is something that Trudeau, despite all of his bluster, was simply incapable of accomplishing. So maybe this is just the PTSD talking, but I honestly don't expect Carney to be really any different than Trudeau has been over the last 10 years. But that being said, there is also some evidence to suggest that he might tone things down at least a little bit. In his first press conference after becoming Prime Minister, he spent about a minute or so talking about what he plans to do to fix the crime problem in Canada, and he didn't mention gun control at all. Not once. Not the confiscation program, not the handgun freeze, not the red or yellow flag laws, nothing. He spoke explicitly about protecting Canadians, almost like he was reading from the Conservative Party platform.
And qualified Canadian workers and Canadian wood.
Will focus on keeping Canada secure as a sovereign nation and Canadians safe in their communities. We'll build a stronger Canadian armed forces to protect Canadians, defend our sovereignty, and support our allies. We'll strengthen our border security with 1,000 more CBSA officers, as well as scores of dog teams, drones, and scanners to fight the traffic of guns and drugs. We'll strengthen Canadian law enforcement by hiring 1,000 more RCMP officers and giving law enforcement more tools to fight crime. We will toughen the criminal code and bail laws for those threatening the safety of Canadians, including making bail harder to get for those charged with stealing cars, with home invasion, human trafficking, and smuggling.
So as you can see, that's a pretty stark contrast from Trudeau. If that was Trudeau up there, he'd be out there spending his full 60 seconds antagonizing us, doing a victory lap, spiking the ball in the end zone, and doing a touchdown dance, all while adding fuel to the fire to divide and distract from the tangible things he could be doing to help instead. Carney did not do that. He didn't even attempt to do that. In fact, so far as I'm aware, in the 3 weeks since the election, Carney hasn't come out with any gun control type announcements or commitments on the topic. The gunblog.ca did come out with a story a couple days after the election reminding everyone that Winnipeg has struck a deal with the Liberals for funding to help facilitate firearms confiscation, but that negotiation happened months ago and the agreement was signed before Carney was even the leader of the party, let alone after the election. And the only thing we actually have to go on so far is what he said during the election. And politicians lie on a good day, but they lie even more during election season. They will say anything and make any false promise in order to get elected. And this is something that Carney has also gotten into hot water for in the last couple of days here. It has come to the public attention that during the election, when he was actively campaigning on elbows up and fighting back against Trump and combating tariffs with tariffs and all that jazz, he was simultaneously behind the scenes passing an order in council to reduce the tariffs on American companies.
And that as of mid-April, there effectively was no standing up to Donald Trump, and there were no tariffs.
So just because he was promising during the election to confiscate firearms ASAP if he's elected, that doesn't actually necessarily mean anything. Politicians lie. It's kind of what they do. We're just used to them lying about us. And then you take a look at Carney's newly formed cabinet. Most of the big gun control names of the last few years are completely gone. Many have retired or are just no longer MPs, but even for the ones that are still around, they're out. Bill Blair is out, Rachel Van Duyn is out, previous public safety ministers David McGuinty and Dominic LeBlanc have been moved far away from the office. Although to be fair to McGuinty, he never really played any substantial role in gun control during his brief stint as public safety minister. Van Duyn was the one doing most of the dirty work for him. Now, something of small concern is that Sean Fraser is now the Minister of Justice, which is an office that has historically had varying amounts of overlap with the gun control file, but all in all, I think Carney's cabinet could be interpreted as something of a good omen for gun owners if you want to take it that way. If Carney truly wanted to come after gun owners in a significant fashion, he could have stacked his cabinet against us much more than he actually did. But instead, we see him giving us a couple of fresh new faces. Or at least fresh faces from a gun control perspective. The new Public Safety Minister, Gary Anandasangari, and the new Secretary of State for Combating Crime, Ruby Sahota, they are unknowns in the gun control sphere and have no real prior interaction with it so far as I'm aware. Now again, myself personally, I don't think we can actually read into this all that much. Ministers will do whatever job Carney tells them to do. So if the order is confiscate firearms and further gun control, they will make that happen. But again, this is more evidence that Carney could be laying the groundwork to give himself an out on the gun control file. And trying to distance himself from this divisive Trudeau-era policy actually makes a lot of practical sense for Carney from a political perspective. Because at the end of a 9-year train wreck, Trudeau had to resign in shame after how unpopular he had become. Now, Carney was able to pick up the pieces and pull out a win during the election because he and the Canadian propaganda machine were able to paint Poilievre as a Trump-style politician. However, if Carney doesn't make significant policy changes to differentiate himself from Trudeau, then in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, when we do have another election, the same thing is going to happen to Carney. The Conservatives will paint him as another Trudeau, and all of Trudeau's unpopularity will stick to him in a way that even the CBC won't be able to make go away. And this was actually part of the Conservatives' campaign in the recent election, but without any real track record on it, the accusations weren't able to stick.
Now, in retrospect, that you look back on the Liberal decisions that you advised Justin Trudeau to take, will you look at the camera in the eye and apologize to the many people who suffered as a result of the inflationary policies that you advised Justin Trudeau to implement?
You know, I said earlier, but I'm going to say it again. I know you want to be running against Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau isn't here.
So if Carney spends the time between the next election and now behaving exactly like Trudeau, then he'll be out on his ass in no time, and he knows it. And this is also why Carney did away with the consumer carbon tax mid-election. Now, it wasn't a matter of whether or not he believed in it, because he definitely believes in a carbon pricing model, like don't kid yourself there, but he needed to demonstrate to the people that he was not Trudeau if he wanted to win the election. And so he set the consumer carbon tax to 0 in favor of other less obvious and less polarizing carbon pricing models. Now likewise, another area he could differentiate himself from Trudeau is this insanity surrounding gun confiscation. Like, I really don't see any future where he undoes the handgun freeze or repeals C-21's red or yellow flag laws or anything, but I don't think it would be impossible for him to do away with the assault-style firearms confiscation program if he wants to do it. He could very easily say he's taken a look at the whole thing and say that he's decided that spending another $5 to $10 billion on something which is not going to provide any tangible public safety benefits is something which just doesn't interest him. Now, again, that sounds like a conservative talking point, but he's been actively implementing a lot of conservative policies and rhetoric all throughout the election and since then as well. So again, it's not because he actually believes in these things, but because he actually needs to do these things in order to stand apart from Trudeau. Now, I certainly don't believe that Carney is on our side or anything here, but this is a move that he might make simply out of self-interest, because I think not doing the confiscation program is more beneficial to him than actually doing it, at least for the moment here. Beyond the reasons I've already shown you, there is another huge glaring problem brewing for Carney right now in Canada, and that's the Albertan independence movement. I might end up doing a separate video on this topic if enough of you are interested in it, so I'm not going to be saying too much about it here, but at the moment, if a referendum is to be held, it will likely be happening early next year in 2026, at least according to Danielle Smith. Now, Carney was probably going to have to make a number of concessions between now and then to quell the movement, most of which are centered around resources and pipelines. But how do you think it's going to play out if Carney has the RCMP running around Canada kicking in doors and confiscating firearms at the same time that many Albertans are wondering if it's worth remaining part of Canada? Now, as it stands now, I don't think the independence movement has quite enough votes to pull it off just yet, but the numbers are close enough that Carney really can't afford to be throwing fuel on the proverbial fire here. Now, right now, the US and separation are two of the hot topic issues that Carney has to solve if he wants Canada to remain unified. And unity was one of the things that Carney campaigned on and still promises. And whether he likes it or not, firearm confiscation directly interferes with the unity crisis that Carney is facing. But as much as anything, this is also just a timing issue. He could just as easily push back the amnesty another year or two as the Liberals have been so fond of doing. Because as it stands now, they only have until the end of October to confiscate the firearms from the first and second ban lists. Like, that's barely only 5 months from now, and no program has been started for civilian confiscation of firearms as of yet. If they want to do it at all, they need to start rolling out something basically immediately if they want to have something completed by October. Would Carney want that to be his first big move as Prime Minister while he's facing a national unity crisis? Probably not. At least not unless his desire for unity is little more than lip service. Now, you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, what about Nathalie Provost? Surely if the Liberals have taken on such a prominent gun control activist and lobbyist into their ranks, then surely they must be about to go off the deep end against us gun owners here. But if you are that kind of optimist who thinks that maybe Carney won't be quite so bad to firearms owners, then I think that she is maybe the best piece of evidence that we have to suggest that Carney may go easy on us. Or at least easier than Trudeau did. Because if you think about it, bringing her on is a bit of a weird move on the part of the Liberals. Because bringing on highly polarizing and ideological figures into a political party is usually more hassle than it's worth. Now, you might think that bringing her on helps signify that they are very serious about confiscating our firearms, but you know what else would be a better way to show that they're serious about confiscating our firearms? Actually confiscating our firearms. They don't need Nathalie Provost around to do that. Now, you might also think that, well, now that she's here, she's going to have more influence over the party's gun control policy. To which I would ask, does she? Does joining the party actually give her more influence? As a member of the party, she is but one voice in hundreds. And while she's there, she's going to have to toe the party line. Yet we saw her and her group, Police Souvient, embarrassing the Liberals into action for most of the last year as a result of their inaction on the gun confiscation program.
We are not banning all assault-style weapons on the market, just those that had been banned in 2020. So we are saying here today that for us it's time to complete what they promised they will do.
The Liberals bringing her into the party means that she won't be able to be as outspoken against the party when they fail to step up on gun control. So as much as anything, this could actually be an attempt to muzzle her a little bit. And not only that, but the Liberals were already, essentially, doing everything that she and Police Souvient were asking for. So I think it's kind of tough for her to have more influence than total influence. So when you add these things all together, I think bringing her on gives the perception of an intent to enact more severe gun control, while not necessarily actually requiring them to do so. And then when Carney formed his cabinet, he put her nowhere near the public safety or gun control file. Instead, she is now the Secretary of State for Nature. Now, some have speculated that this gives her an angle to go after hunting, and I don't know, maybe it does.
Given your background, is this at all about hunting, Madame Provost? Just given who you are and your advocacy on guns?
I worked in the last 10 years for the Environment Department in Quebec, so I'm very, very proud of this assignation.
But hunting really is one of those rare topics which is still firmly within provincial jurisdiction and discretion. At least in all the ways that it matters to us as firearms owners. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's impossible for her to weasel her way into these conversations or to be later promoted to the gun control side of the cabinet later on, but this is, again, news which is more promising than it actually isn't. Now, as I've been cautioning throughout this whole video, I don't think that any of this actually means a bright future for us firearms owners. I think that Carney fully intends to continue Trudeau's legacy of punching down against us law-abiding gun owners. He said as much during the election, and even the Liberal Party website has a policy declaration titled Mark Carney's Plan, where it details that it is in fact Mark Carney's plan to continue the persecution of us firearms owners. So even though there is actually a pretty cogent case to be made for Carney to back down from this gun confiscation nonsense, I'm not of the mind that this is something that he is interested in giving up on. Like, I fully expect for him to double down on all of the divisive Trudeau-era gun control policies, and I wouldn't be surprised if he took it even further than Trudeau did. But I would think that he would probably wait and try to get a majority before he places his hand on that front, which, for all we know, might happen a week or two from now with all the suspicious after-the-fact recounts which are happening in Canada right now. And speaking of Alberta, Danielle Smith is also digging in her heels on this angle as well. Recently, she attended a speaking event with the CEO of the Alberta Prosperity Project and MLA Scott Sear. They spoke for about an hour on all sorts of things, primarily relating to the Albertan economy and the greater desire for autonomy and independence on all sorts of topics. But towards the end of the discussion, Danielle Smith had some interesting things to say in relation to firearms ownership.
I was looking this up to try to figure out how, knowing that Carney still wants to go after law-abiding gun owners. Well, I wondered if there was anything that we could do provincially. And I found this 2018 paper that was written that said that we as a province have the right to choose not to enforce certain criminal code provisions. That they said that the check on the use of the criminal law power at the federal level and the abuse of the criminal law power at the federal level is that the provinces can always say we're not enforcing that, and that is a legitimate exercise of our right over administration of justice. Now, I don't know if that was just a fringe opinion of the legal community, or if that is an accepted view in the legal community.
Now, I've never heard anything about the provinces having the ability to simply ignore certain criminal code provisions, so I think that may be some wishful thinking on her part, but I will look into it, and if there's any validity to it, you can be sure that I'll be making a separate video on it. However, then she went on to say this.
Would you consider challenging that under 9213 of the Charter so that, because we're in control of property and civil rights in Alberta, yes. And I would really think that would be our path out?
Completely. I want to have that fight. I want them to try to argue that somebody who is legally purchased, legally used, and never used in a criminal way, a firearm is somehow under their criminal power as opposed to our property rights power? Absolutely. That's part of it, is that I think that there's a robust discussion to have around this. I think that they are misusing their power when they go as far as they do to say that because a gun looks a certain way, therefore it's by definition criminal, therefore they have the power to ban it. I just think that's an inappropriate use of the law.
Now that is actually a pretty well understood phenomenon in Canadian law. And for longtime viewers of the channel, that might actually sound a little familiar. Last year when I did my video making the case for why I think the handgun freeze is actually unconstitutional here in Canada, much of the basis for my argument came from that idea. And this is found in the Constitution Acts of Canada, not the Charter itself, but at least he had the section right. But Section 9213 of the Canadian Constitution involves the exclusive authority of the provinces to make laws related to property and civil rights in the province. Firearms are property, so it makes sense that this should be provincial jurisdiction. However, the government has decided to use their criminal law powers under Section 91, subsection 27 of the Constitution to gain control of this kind of property on the perception that this is somehow a public safety issue. And this question, or at least part of this question, was already discussed and solved in a Supreme Court case going back to the year 2000, known as the Reference Re Firearms Act. Now, I'm not going to go over the entirety of the case here, but the TLDR of it was that the Supreme Court ultimately decided that the regulation of property found in the Firearms Act was in fact a valid exercise of the criminal law powers found in the Constitution, and not an infringement on the property right powers which the provinces are supposed to wield. Now, that might come off as though the argument is already settled, but the court wasn't really asking whether all possible gun control laws are criminal law, but rather if the measures found in the Firearms Act are in fact valid criminal law. And one of the most important distinctions that the court found was that the purpose of the Firearms Act was to reduce only the misuse of firearms, not also the legitimate use of firearms. And that it was not actually attempting to achieve some other ulterior or colorable motive, such as the complete and total regulation of the production, trade, or ownership of firearms. Firearms that even the Supreme Court back then referred to as ordinary firearms. Now fast forward 20 years and the government has suddenly arbitrarily rebranded these ordinary firearms as assault weapons in order to further their political agenda. But now that we have the OICs and C-21 on the books, we can ask a different question of the courts. Or at least Danielle Smith seems to think so anyway.
I think there's probably a pretty epic battle coming on that, and we're prepared for it.
Now, unfortunately, this battle would be not unlike the one that the CCFR is currently embroiled in. They've spent 5 years now going after a different angle on this conversation with the misuse of Section 117.15 of the Criminal Code, and the cases in both the federal court as well as the Federal Court of Appeal resulted in defeat. And the result of these rulings, especially the recent one from the Federal Court of Appeal, is that I now have absolutely zero faith in the court's objectivity and rationality. Now, frankly, I don't think the courts have any intention to respect the law or the Constitution where firearms owners are involved. And I think the CCFR has come to the same conclusion because in episode 189 of the CCFR's podcast, they said that they probably wouldn't be going to the Supreme Court. They said it was about 70-30, 70% chance they won't go, 30% chance they will go.
I haven't made a final decision. 70% no, 30% we might apply. Remember, you don't get to just go to the Supreme Court if you don't pay a fee and just show up there or something like that. You apply. Here's the question. Is it interesting to you guys? And they decide whether or not they want to take your case. Other than that, like, you're at the end of the road. But again, all that stuff costs money. We spent a lot of money on this anyway. I mean, that had to be done. And we said we would fight them at every level. We absolutely did at every possible level. And I guess we can continue to do that if both if it's reasonable, some chance of success, and of course, if all of you continue to support the CCFR, that's what we would do.
And honestly, I kind of find this to be extremely disappointing. But at the same time, I get it. Court is extremely expensive. And if the courts have abandoned all reason and have simply decided that the government doesn't have to abide by the law or the Constitution in relation to firearms owners, then pursuing the case any further is just, like, objectively, it's just a waste of money. So, I get it. But I'm also of the mind that when you're down by 5 on your own 40-yard line with 3 seconds to go and you have only one play left in the game, you throw the Hail Mary. You don't throw the Hail Mary because you think it's a high probability play. You throw it because it's your only remaining hope to win. But to be fair to the CCFR, they may not be playing football. They might think they're running a marathon. And it might be that for them, it doesn't make sense to burn out on mile 10. Perhaps they're going to want to tackle the angle that Danielle Smith was talking about, and maybe they only have the funding to go after one of these things. But if that's the case, then the CCFR giving up on their chance at the Supreme Court could also hurt future court cases. Like, rolling over and allowing their case to set a bad precedent on something which they should be able to win can hamper future legal efforts for reversing gun control in the future. And I say that this is something that they should be able to win because the ruling from Chief Justice Montagny and the Federal Court of Appeal was not just bad, but it was also very weird in some ways. Because there were multiple places in the ruling where he made his decision regarding something and then quoted some precedent or evidence to support that decision, and then that precedent or evidence directly disproved the thing that he said he was deciding. Now, I plan to make a video covering some of these things hopefully by the weekend if I can, so that maybe it can help the CCFR decide whether or not they do want to go to the Supreme Court if they're actually allowed to go. And it feels like his ruling should be reasonably easy to overturn based simply on his own words. At least that would be the case if the courts cared at all about objectivity anymore. But if objectivity was still relevant to the courts, then we wouldn't be in the position that we're in the first place here. So it's not like the CCFR's court case is a lost cause or anything, actually far from it. I think that in fact it's the courts themselves that are the lost cause here. But if funding really is the only hurdle to them, then maybe we just need to make a point of fundraising a little bit more. Runkle of the Bailey just recently did a Give, Send, Go campaign for his own attempt at a Supreme Court case where he raised the necessary funds in just a few days. Now, I know the CCFR does their own fundraising through their own website, but maybe they should make a video reminding everyone that it's there and asking them to donate to get them to the Supreme Court. Now, Runkle's doing a lot of his own work for it, so his funding level is actually going to be a lot lower than the CCFR's would be. But considering how quickly that Runkle got his money, I don't think that should be out of reach for the CCFR. And I've actually donated to the CCFR in the past for this, and I also donated to Runkle's recent campaign, and I think that a lot of my viewers, a lot of you guys, would donate to see the CCFR head to the Supreme Court of Canada if they can. And maybe we could also somehow make a point of getting other organizations on board, like the NFA or the CSSA, because for me it doesn't really make sense that the CCFR should have to foot the bill all on their own here either. Like, I think everyone in the firearms community should be behind them as much as they can afford to be. That includes me, that includes you, and that includes all of the other organizations. And I think that together, as a community, we have the funds to do it. We just need to be committed enough to make this happen. But either way, it doesn't mean the end for firearms ownership in Canada. As Danielle Smith has shown, there are still plenty of other legal avenues for us to pursue in Canada, and there's always the small possibility that Carney takes Canada in a more sensible direction on this front by ceasing the persecution of our community. Not that such a thing is likely, but hey, a guy can dream. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.